Bat black night has draped a cloak of sinister shadow across London's West End. Shopkeepers have pulled down their blinds and their bag-laden customers have shuffled back to the safety of their homes or hotels. Dull street lamps have flickered into life as the clocks tick relentlessly towards the witching hour. A death-like stillness hangs heavy in the air, and as the pervading silence becomes both ominous and overwhelming, things begin to stir in cobwebbed corners as the ghosts of previous times creep from the dark recesses to walk once more the places that they knew so well in life. Welcome to a collection of chilling ghostly tales as we fearlessly sally forth onto the streets of London's West End to confront those lurking phantoms whose stories will instill feelings of fear and fascination in equal measure. From the hollow moans that emanate from the time-worn granite of the capital's oldest monument, to the pained death throes of the victim of a long-ago murder that reverberate from the inky blackness of a forbidding subterranean vault. From a hidden tavern, where the ghost of a cheating officer makes a decided nuisance of himself from time to time, to the dark lake, from the depths of which a headless figure has been known to emerge to send cold shivers racing down the spines of startled onlookers. A cursed tree, two haunted theatres, a gloomy square from the centre of which the agonized screams of bygone executions echoed down the centuries. And if all that is not enough to chill the marrow of even the most sceptical among you, then how about one of London's grandest hotels, where guests checking into a certain room are all but guaranteed a decent night's unrest? The ghosts are waiting for us, patiently biding their time. So turn the lights down low, pull that chair closer to the fire, and let us embark upon our spectral sojourn as we set out in search of the restless wraiths that haunt London's West End. To begin with, may I just say that there is some confusion as to which parts of London actually constitute the West End. Even that font of all knowledge, Wikipedia, struggles to define its exact boundaries. So for the purposes of this video, I am going to focus on the district that lies to the west of the City of London on the north side of the River Thames. Our night amongst the spectres begins here on Fleet Street at the Old Cock Tavern, a venerable old hostelry that boasts London's thinnest pub frontage, giving the impression that it's just been slotted into the gap between the buildings on either side. It happens to be situated across the road from Hen and Chicken Court, a notorious spot that was the location of a shop once run by Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. However, I'll save his story for another video. Speaking of across the road, that's exactly where the Cock Tavern stood until 1886, in which year it closed its doors for the very last time and was subsequently demolished to make way for the Bank of England Royal Courts branch, which itself is now a new pub called the Old Bank of England. Are you with me so far? Anyway, it was on the site now occupied by the Old Bank of England that the Old Cock Tavern stood until its demolition. An illustration showing what the interior had looked like appeared in Philip Norman's book London Vanished and Vanishing, published in 1905. It was this building and this interior that would have been familiar to the likes of Samuel Pepys, who was, according to his diary, mighty merry when he dined here with the actress Elizabeth Knepp, a woman with whom he was, to put it politely, slightly besotted. Dr. Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith were regulars here in the 18th century, as was Alfred Lord Tennyson in the 19th. Tennyson even went so far as to compose Will Waterproof's lyrical monologue on the premises in 1843, a poem that starts badly and then spends 32 verses getting even worse. Permit me, by way of an appetizer, to recite for you the all-important opening verse of the poem. O plump-head waiter at the Cock, to which I most resort, how goes the time? 'Tis 5 o'clock, go fetch a pint of port. But let it not be such as that you set before chance comers, but such whose father grape grew fat on Lusitanian summers. Thank you, Alfred. We'll let you know. The poem wasn't actually published in full until 1853, by which time Tennyson had risen to the dizzy height of poet laureate, and thereafter wags and wits, on taking their seats at the alehouse, found themselves unable to resist the temptation to inquire of the head waiter if he still had any of that port whose father grape had grown fat on Lusitanian summers, an inquiry that often received the curt reply, "Yes, and it's 9 shillings a bottle." In 1886 it was announced that the Cock Tavern was to be demolished, and on the 10th of April that year it closed its doors for the very last time. To mark its demise, the owners sent Tennyson a beer tankard inscribed with the opening verse of Will Waterproof's lyrical monologue, and a grateful Tennyson wrote back thanking them for their thoughtful gesture and assuring them that he would keep it as an heirloom in his family. However, you can't keep a good alehouse down, and it wasn't long before a new site had been acquired on the other side of Fleet Street, and in 1887 the new Old Cock was built, and many of the Old Cock's fixtures, fittings and furnishings found themselves moved across the road from the old to the new Old Cock. Keep up at the back there. So, although it has long claimed to date from 1549, in reality the structure that greets visitors today is in fact a late 19th century incarnation of an older hostelry, much of the interior of which made its way across Fleet Street to be incorporated into the new interior, until, that is, a devastating fire in the 1990s destroyed much of that new old interior, necessitating a restoration that painstakingly pieced back together the little that could be salvaged from the ashes and recreated what couldn't, using old photographs as a guide. And if all that has left your head spinning in bewildered befuddlement, then let's step inside and recover our equilibrium with a well-earned libation or two. Sit yourself down next to the fireplace, and I'll get us a pint of port each, and as we absorb the ambience of this new old hostelry, permit me to regale you with a few of the ghost stories associated with it. Back in the early 1980s, when I was finding my way in the world of London ghost walks, the pub's landlady was a characterful Irishwoman by the name of Sarah Kennedy. Those were the days when Fleet Street was still the street of ink, and journalists, printers and their like rubbed shoulders here with lawyers and litigants, not to mention a goodly smattering of ne'er-do-wells. The beer flowed till the early hours, the babble of conversation was incessant, and raucous laughter often rang out from groups huddled by the bar, as jokes and anecdotes were exchanged between people who really knew how to tell a rattling good yarn. On Friday nights I used to end my ghost walk at the Old Cock Tavern, and Sarah and her staff were more than happy to entertain and enthrall my clients with tales of paranormal encounters that they had had at the pub. 2 in particular became regular stories on my ghost walk. The likes of Pepys, Johnson, Tennyson, and even Dickens, who was known to imbibe at the Cock, would make for illustrious ghosts for the premises, but of course when they knew the pub, it stood on the other side of the road. Oliver Goldsmith, on the other hand, has managed to make the transition from the other side, and with very good reason, for he's buried in the yard behind the pub. Actually, I should perhaps clarify that last statement. So set down your tankard for a moment and let's take a stroll round to the rear of the pub, which is even slimmer than the front. The yard is in fact the churchyard of the Temple Church, and it was here that Oliver Goldsmith was laid to rest following his death on the 4th of April, 1774. His gravestone can be seen over by the fence, although he isn't actually buried beneath it, for this is a later memorial, and if the truth be known, no one is certain precisely where his remains lie. In the early 1980s, the Cock Tavern's rubbish was often left outside the back door, and one night in 1984, an Australian barmaid was given the task of taking out the trash. She made her way to the rear door, propped it open, and then began placing the bags outside. Having disposed of 2, she turned round to pick up a third, and having done so, swung round to place it on the ground outside. But as she did so, she found herself face to face with the disembodied head of a man floating in mid-air outside the door. Letting out an almighty scream, she went racing back inside, where staff and customers alike calmed her down, whereupon she recounted her startling experience. Sarah suggested that she should go upstairs and sit in the upstairs room for a while, a suggestion the barmaid readily agreed to, and she made her way up the stairs. However, no sooner had she got to the top of the first set of stairs than she started screaming again. Staff and customers rushed to her aid and found her staring at a portrait of Oliver Goldsmith that then hung on the wall. "That's him," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the portrait. "That's the man I saw outside." Several other people had encounters with Goldsmith's ghost during Sarah's tenure. One was a window cleaner who arrived one day to clean the windows of the rooms at the back of the pub. When he came down an hour or so later, he said to Sarah, "I've done all the windows except the ones in the top room because your husband told me not to bother." Puzzled, Sarah told him that she didn't actually have a husband and that all the staff had been downstairs in the bar throughout his visit. "Well, there was some bloke in the top room when I went up," the window cleaner explained, "and he told me not to bother with those windows." "Show me," said Sarah, and the two of them headed up the stairs. However, as they passed the portrait of Oliver Goldsmith, the window cleaner stopped abruptly and, pointing towards it, said, "It's him. That's the bloke I saw upstairs." I'll leave you, dear viewer, to decide whether this was a genuine paranormal experience or just a good excuse not to clean the upstairs windows. But the clock is ticking, and we have many other haunted locations to visit, so finish your drink and we'll leave the Cock Tavern to its memories and its shadows and make our way to nearby Lincoln's Inn Fields. Although it has the distinction of being the largest square in London, surrounded by an eclectic mix of houses and buildings from different eras and in many styles, there was a time when what is now Lincoln's Inn Fields comprised two fields, Pursefield and Cupfield, and being an open space outside but close to the cities of London and Westminster, it was occasionally used for public executions. The most gruesome such event to occur here was the execution of the participants in the Babington plot, a Catholic plot to assassinate Elizabeth I and replace her on the throne with her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. A chief mover in the conspiracy was 24-year-old Sir Anthony Babington, although the actual instigator of it was probably a priest named John Ballard. The plot, though, was uncovered, and the conspirators were arrested, tried, found guilty of treason, and were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, one of the most horrible means of punishment ever devised. A quick warning: if you are of a nervous disposition or eating, you might want to put your fingers in your ears for this next bit. I'll give you a few seconds to do so. Oh, and if you're eating, please be sure to set down your fork before attempting to stick your fingers in your ears. Hanging, drawing, and quartering consisted of being hanged until you were half dead but still conscious, whereupon you would be cut down and forced to watch as the executioner sliced off your genitals, dug out your entrails, and cut out your heart, by which time you would, of course, be quite dead. Finally, your body would be quartered and taken to be displayed at strategically important points, in London these often being over the city gates, and your head, dipped in pitch to preserve it, would also be placed on public view as a warning to others who might be contemplating treason. It was a cruel and vicious death, so as Sir Anthony Babington and his co-conspirators languished in the Tower of London, they must have endured many tortured nights, knowing the fate that awaited them. Since they had held some of their secret meetings in the Cup and Purse fields, it was here that their executions were ordered to be carried out, and on Tuesday the 20th of September, 1586, the first group of plotters that included Ballard and Babington were fastened to hurdles at the Tower of London and were dragged through the autumnal streets to a scaffold that had been erected mighty high to ensure that the thousands of onlookers who came to watch could enjoy, or in some cases endure, an uninterrupted view of justice being done. The first to die was the priest John Ballard, and, as his fellow conspirators looked on, the executioner set about his grim task. The majority of Ballard's companions turned their heads away, unable to witness the agonies that they knew awaited them. They fell to their knees, bared their heads, and prayed that their suffering would be short. The unflinching Babington, however, refused to look away, and he didn't even remove his hat as he watched Ballard's gruesome end. It was with characteristic coolness that Sir Anthony took his turn on the gallows. But as his body was cut down and the evisceration began, he cried over and over again, "Spare me, Lord Jesus!" One by one, the conspirators suffered the dreadful penalty, and according to the historian William Camden, who may well have been present, the day's events were not without some note of cruelty. Indeed, such was the public outcry over the horrific spectacle that Elizabeth relented slightly and gave orders that the next group were each to be hanged until quite dead before disemboweling began. Is it any wonder that some of those traversing the square's outer perimeter on dark winter nights have been terrified by the sounds of agonized moans and pain-racked screams echoing from its shadows? A plaque on the floor of the little circular shelter that stands at the centre of Lincoln's Inn Fields marks the approximate spot where William Lord Russell, who was sentenced to death for his part in the Rye House plot of 1683, bravely met his end. Despite Russell's claim that he had neither knowledge of nor complicity in the plot to assassinate Charles II and his brother James the Duke of York, he was sentenced to death. His wife, Lady Rachel Russell, pleaded with the king to spare her husband's life, but Charles would not be moved, observing wryly, "If I do not kill him, then he will soon kill me." And thus it was that on the 21st of July, 1683, William Lord Russell strode bravely to his death here in Lincoln's Inn Fields, observing stoically that the pain of the axe would last but a few moments and would cause him less pain than the drawing of a tooth. Unfortunately, the axe was wielded by the notorious Jack Ketch, a man whose name was a byword for botched and bungled executions. It was customary for those about to be beheaded to tip the executioner to ensure that they would deliver a swift and painless death, and Russell duly handed over 10 guineas to Ketch before kneeling to place his head on the block. Ketch did such a bad job that after the axe hit the side of the condemned man's head, Russell looked up at him and said, "You dog, did I give you 10 guineas to use me so inhumanely?" Ketch later defended his ineptitude by claiming that his lordship had in fact moved as he brought the axe down. Whether Russell's ghost is another to haunt Lincoln's Inn Fields is unknown, but there have been reports of a shadowy apparition being seen drifting around the shelter at night, and this, coupled with the pain-racked moans and groans, helps make the square a truly chilling place when darkness has fallen. Our next haunted site stands in Wellington Street off Strand and is the Lyceum Theatre. In the late 19th century, the rafters of the Lyceum Theatre, now restored to its original splendour, echoed to the thunderous applause of audiences that had come to marvel at the lavish Shakespearean productions staged here by Henry Irving and Ellen Terry under the management of one Bram Stoker, the future author of Dracula. One couple, however, got an added bonus with their ticket in the 1880s when they happened to look over the balcony during an interval and saw the severed head of a man leering up at them from a lady's lap in the stalls below. Their curiosity aroused, they rose from their seats to investigate, but were forced to sit back down when the play resumed. During the second half of the performance, they kept looking over the balcony, but the lady had a shawl over her lap. When the curtain finally came down, they raced downstairs and observed the lady leaving the theatre. Unfortunately, such was the press of the crowd that they lost her and were left without any explanation for the grisly enigma that they had witnessed. Some years later, the husband happened to visit a house in Yorkshire where to his surprise he saw a portrait of a man whose face was identical to that which he and his wife had seen in the lady's lap at the Lyceum. Somewhat mystified, he inquired of the owner of the house who the man was, and received the chilling reply that it was a distant ancestor of his who had been beheaded for treason and whose family once owned the land on which the Lyceum stands. For our next ghostly tale, we are heading to nearby Surrey Street, where we will stand outside the now defunct Aldwych station. When I say defunct, I mean that it is no longer operational as a stop on the Underground network, but as a station, it is incredibly busy. For a start, it features on the Hidden London tours offered by Transport for London, and a descent into its abandoned depths is a truly fascinating, not to say at times spooky, experience. It is also a favoured film location and has starred in movies and TV shows as diverse as Fast and Furious, not the last one, the 156th before that, V for Vendetta, 28 Days Later, Sherlock, Mr. Selfridge, Luther, The Fallen Sun, and Secrets of the London Underground, to name but a few of its starring roles. Add to its reputation as a Hollywood A-lister the fact that it has also been used for art shows, book signings, and fashion shoots, and you can see that, although it was retired from public service as an actual station in 1994, Aldwych has most certainly not declined into an inactive dotage. In fact, it is without doubt the most used of London's disused stations. Aldwych was opened in 1907 and was originally called Strand Station, a name that can still be seen on a former entrance or exit around the corner. However, since what is now Charing Cross Underground Station was then called Strand Station, it became, to say the least, a little confusing for passengers and staff alike, and thus this Strand Station's name was changed to Aldwych, named for the newly constructed thoroughfare which was called Aldwych. Since it's been around for over 117 years, Aldwych Station has had plenty of time to acquire an otherworldly population of residents, and there are several ghostly tales associated with it. In 2002, the station was the subject of a TV ghost hunt when the team from the show Most Haunted donned World War II uniforms. Oh, I forgot to mention that the station was used as an air raid shelter in the Second World War, and descended into its eerie depths in search of any restless wraiths that might also be wandering there. According to the Internet Movie Database, the episode wasn't without drama. Yvette thinks she sees a figure in the tunnel, and a motion detector goes off with no one there, the brief synopsis of the show informs, although the solitary reviewer of said episode wasn't particularly bowled over by it. Anticlimactic ghost hunt, as the hunters scare themselves rather than actually being scared by ghosts. The medium was talking absolute nonsense. The uniforms were nice, though. Well, you can't please all the people all the time, and I suppose you can't do a casting call for actual ghosts. But the station does have its fair share of paranormal activity. There is the ghostly man in uniform, who witnesses say might be a member of staff, or should that be former member of staff, and who, according to some accounts, tragically died on the track. Sadly, specific facts about exactly how and when his tragic demise, is there any other sort of demise, one wonders, actually occurred, are tragically hard to come by. Spectral singing has been known to drift through the station, and the sound of ghostly chattering has been heard emanating from dark corners. Then there is the smell of cigarette smoke and perfume, both of which are sometimes known to hang heavy in the air. And as if all those hauntings aren't sufficient for one abandoned station to accommodate, there is the ghost of the Victorian actress who has been seen floating around the platforms dressed in what has been described as traditional theatre garments. There can be no doubt about it. Aldwych Station is possessed of an ambience that is both unique and absorbing. Add to these the chance of an encounter with one or more of the spectral residents, and the only question you should be asking yourself is, when can I visit? For our next potential spectral encounter, we're going to make our way to the banks of the River Thames, where stands London's oldest monument, Cleopatra's Needle. Originally erected outside the Temple of the Sun at Heliopolis in 1450 BC, this mysterious obelisk was moved to Alexandria in 14 BC, hence its association with the legendary Egyptian queen. It was brought to London in 1878 and has stood proudly on the banks of the River Thames ever since. There is, without doubt, something about this mysterious granite column that is difficult to define. Perhaps it is the fact that the two sphinxes on either side of it face towards the monument rather than look away from it, which is how they should be positioned, as their function is to protect rather than to admire the monolith. Or maybe it is just the sheer magnitude of the column, soaring as it does to an awe-inspiring height of 68 feet, and making those who stand beneath it feel tiny in comparison. Or perhaps it is the ghostly tales that swirl around it in abundance. Some of those who pass it on still winter nights have been startled by a low moan that seems to issue from the very stone itself. Others have reported seeing a nebulous naked figure emerge from the pillar. As they watch, it races briskly across the riverside terrace and throws itself over the wall towards the river, although no splash is ever heard, and when people go to investigate, they are mystified to find no sign of anyone or anything floundering in the water. But one of the best-known tales about the Needle dates from the early 20th century, when a policeman crossing nearby Waterloo Bridge one foggy night was startled when an hysterical young woman came racing towards him and told him that someone was in great danger and that he must come with her without delay in order that a terrible tragedy might be averted. The constable duly followed the woman through the dense fog and arrived at Cleopatra's Needle just in time to find a disorientated young woman teetering unsteadily on the steps leading down to the Thames. Grabbing hold of her, he pulled her back from the brink, but on spinning her round was astonished to find himself face to face with the young lady who had just alerted him on Waterloo Bridge. Turning to ask for an explanation, he found himself even more surprised when there was no sign of her whatsoever, despite the fact that she had been standing right behind him just a few seconds earlier. History doesn't record whether he asked the woman he had rescued for an explanation. What is certain is that to pass this ancient artifact on a bright summer's day is chilling enough, but to stand beneath it on a dark winter's night with a howling wind blowing around it, well, let's just say that on nights such as this, the chance of an encounter with Oliver Goldsmith's head at the Old Cock Tavern doesn't seem so bad after all. Tucked away between the Embankment and Strand, you will find a sinister subterranean thoroughfare that exudes a chilling, some might even say menacing, ambience. It is called Lower Robert Street, and it meanders from York Buildings to Savoy Place. Surprises aplenty await the intrepid explorer who dares venture into this sunken world of twisting shadows, not least amongst them the ever-present danger that at any moment they might find themselves mown down by a black cab, since taxi drivers are about the only mortals who know of this convenient covert cut-through. Lower Robert Street is one of the few surviving Adelphi arches, part of a grand 18th century scheme by the Adam brothers to fashion elegant dwellings overlooking the River Thames. Since the land hereabouts was marshy and prone to flooding, sinking foundations into it was very much a no-no, so instead they constructed sturdy arches on which to build their properties, and Lower Robert Street was one of those vaults. The initial intention was to use the cellars as storage space for the houses up above, but since the Thames was so close by, damp and mildew put paid to that idea, and by the 19th century a troglodyte community of dispossessed outsiders had colonised the arches, and your average Londoner entered the labyrinth at his or her peril. An article that appeared in the Surrey Comet on Saturday the 30th of August 1856 gave readers a disturbing insight into the delights awaiting them should they ever deign to stray into this twilight world. Generally, there appears no sign of life about the yawning entrance to the gloomy depth. Most persons content themselves with a passing glance at this place and walk on with perhaps a slight feeling of curiosity as to the nature of the region to which the arch is an opening. Should anyone, however, choose to satisfy his curiosity, he will find matter for strange reflection. After proceeding a few yards down the covered way, there will be nothing before him but thick darkness. If the visit is made at night, the visitor is almost certain to see some infatuated individual, helpless under the fascination of a decoy, being led as a victim to the predatory propensities of the decoy's friends. He will soon turn up a passage into which no light ever makes its way. A lucifer match is lighted, and lo, on the sides of the passage are seen recesses which are frequently the sleeping places of wretched human beings, whose poverty occasioned by misfortune or vice has deprived them of every other resting place. A layer of rotten straw filled with all kinds of vermin is the only covering of the dank floor. What infinite possibilities of murder open upon the mind as it surveys these recesses never visited by daylight! What thorough protection do they afford to the fugitive criminal? One of the desperate characters to whom the arches were home in the 19th century was poor Jenny, a Victorian prostitute who was strangled by one of her clients on the grim bundle of filthy rags that she used as her bed. Today, Jenny's terrifying, pain-racked screams, followed by a rhythmic drumming as her feet repeat her death tattoo upon the stones, occasionally echo through the dingy vault, shattering the stillness and chilling the marrow of those who happen to be in the vicinity. This is not the sort of place at which to linger for any longer than is absolutely necessary, so let's leave this doleful subterranean world to its fleeting shadows as the curtain rises on our next haunted location. We've arrived in Haymarket, and we're standing opposite the Theatre Royal, where fortuitously the same play that is the subject of part of this ghost story has at the time of our visit been revived, albeit with a different cast. So let's travel back through the foggy mists of time to the year of our Lord 2009, when Sir Patrick Stewart and Sir Ian McKellen were enthralling audiences here in Waiting for Godot. During one performance, Sir Patrick came off stage and informed his co-star, "I just saw a ghost on stage during Act 1. Now, I know that didn't sound anything like Sir Patrick, but I'm not even going to attempt an impersonation. I mean, the man has scary telepathic powers, and I've still got a cursed tree to visit." The theatre's director was quoted by a newspaper as having observed, "Patrick was stunned. I would not say frightened, but I would say impressed." Recalling his experience, Sir Patrick said that the apparition was that of a man who was standing in the wings wearing what looked like a beige coat and twill trousers. The consensus among stagehands was that Sir Patrick had seen the ghost of John Baldwin Buckstone, who had a long association with the Theatre Royal in the 19th century, first as a comic actor, then as a playwright, and finally as its actor-manager from 1853 to 1877, during which time he staged some 200 productions, pioneered the concept of the afternoon matinee, and transformed the house into the leading comic theatre of the day. Buckstone was a great friend of Charles Dickens, who once confessed that, as a boy, he had been so moved by Buckstone's performances that he went home to dream of his comicalities. Although Buckstone didn't die in the building, he actually died at his home in Kent. His ghost made the first of its returns to the theatre within a year of his death. Since then, several illustrious theatrical figures have seen his spectral form in parts of the building, where he seems to appear whenever comedies are being staged. In 2009, I had the good fortune to work with the late Sir Donald Sinden on a project about London's theatres, and he told me about his experience of having seen Buckstone's ghost whilst playing in The Heiress with Sir Ralph Richardson in 1949. It occurred on the staircase on the Suffolk Street side of the theatre, where the dressing rooms and the stage door are located. One night, as Sir Donald and the actress Jill Cadell were coming down the stairs from their dressing rooms en route to the stage, they passed the solid figure of a man dressed in an old-fashioned dark suit, looking out of the window onto Suffolk Street. Since this was the floor where Ralph Richardson's dressing room was located, they presumed it was him, and bade him "Good evening, Ralph," and on receiving no reply, continued on their way towards the stage. But having descended one flight, they suddenly realised that Richardson should be on stage at that moment. Hurrying back up to see why he wasn't, they were surprised to find the figure had gone. Indeed, there was no sign of the man anywhere. In 1996, the theatre launched a backstage tour and invited a group of VIP guests to join a dry run of the proposed route. An important inclusion was a visit to what had been Buckstone's room, where participants would be treated to anecdotes about the man who had given so much to the theatre. As the rehearsal began, the stage manager unlocked the room and went off to attend to other business. When the party arrived at Buckstone's room, the guide turned the handle and discovered that the door was locked. The mystified manager returned with the key, but no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to unlock it. Once the tour had departed, however, the door opened easily. Evidently, Buckstone was not eager to welcome guests into his former room. Anyway, it's time to bring the curtain down on this stop on our wander with the spirits, as to be perfectly frank, I'm getting tired of waiting. So let's make haste through the streets of the West End to arrive in St. James's Park, a place that has seen much happiness and much tragedy. I have conducted in-depth and extensive research into the history of St. James's Park, and I am now able to lay before you the fruits of my labours. It all started in 1531, when Henry VIII acquired the land hereabouts and the Court of St. James was established. In 1603, the park was laid out for James I, with menagerie and duck decoys. What's a duck decoy? Methinks a little more studies required. In 1531, I've done that bit. In 1660, the park was re-landscaped for Charles II in formal French style. Bloody 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 blah bloody 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 blah 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 bloody blah blah. Here's the important bit. In 1827, John Nash appointed to carry out present landscape in informal style for George IV. The reason that's important is that prior to Nash's 1827 rejuvenation, what is today a picturesque lake was little more than a miasmic marshy canal, and the haunting of St James's Park has its origins back in those days. Just outside the park stand the Wellington barracks, where are based the foot battalions on public duties around the royal palaces in the vicinity. The building that confronts visitors today dates from 1833, so it is with a previous building on the site that our ghostly tale concerns itself. According to Elliot O'Donnell in his book Ghosts of London, published in 1932, in or about the year 1784, a sergeant in the Guards cut off his wife's head and threw her body into the canal that then ran through the park. What he did with her head is not known, nor is it known what subsequently happened to him, whether, for instance, he was apprehended and punished, or whether he managed to elude conviction and escape punishment. With regards to the haunting, in 1804, sentries on duty in the park at night declared that they saw a headless woman there, and that she walked past them, greatly of course to their alarm, and then disappeared. The matter was much talked about, naturally, by soldiers in the guardroom, and sentries went to their various posts in the park, shivering and shaking. The weather, seemingly, mattered not. The headless phantom came on fine nights when the park was bathed in moonlight and the great silent trees stood out even more clearly than in the daytime, and it came on dark, stormy nights when the wind blew and howled among the trees, and the rain fell in sheer torrents. Heat and cold, too, had no effect on it. Its nightly appearance could be counted on. A soldier, pacing to and fro, apprehensively watching the black shadows of the solemn oaks and elms, would suddenly see a figure emerge from behind some tree and glide noiselessly towards him. He did not challenge it. He shut his eyes and kept them shut till it had passed. Why? Because it was headless, the headless phantom of the murdered wife.
O'Donnell went on to say that an investigation was carried out by officers and a local magistrate,
and several of the sentries testified on oath about their experiences. But it all came to nothing, because after all, if a headless ghost is wandering the park, bullets and bayonets are no defence at all.
And lest you think that the fearsome apparition is safely consigned to days of yore, you should know that reported sightings of her continue into the modern age. On some nights, a headless woman has been seen rising from the rippling waters of the dark lake. Gliding across the surface, she drifts slowly onto dry land, where she suddenly breaks into a frenzied run, her arms flailing wildly about her. Petrified onlookers stand rooted to the spot as the hideous apparition moves into the bushes, where it fades away into thin air. Goodness me, the night is passing quickly, and we still have so much to see, so let's not keep the ghosts waiting as we hurry over to St James's Place, where tucked away in an easily missable cul-de-sac is this curious old abode, the exterior of which is painted a vivid shade of yellow. It is number 19 St James's Place, and it almost seems to cower beneath the surrounding properties. For much of the 19th century, two spinster sisters, Anne and Harriet Pearson, owned the house. The two sisters were deeply devoted to one another, and when Anne died in 1858, Harriet opted to live alone in the house they had shared for so long. In November 1864, Harriet was taken ill whilst visiting relatives in Brighton. She was brought back to her house in London, and her two nieces, Mrs. Coppinger and Miss Emma Pearson, and her nephew's wife, Mrs. John Pearson, moved in to nurse her. On the 23rd of December that year, a heavy snowstorm swept across the capital, and a thick mist descended upon St. James's Place. Mrs. Coppinger and Miss Pearson retired to bed, leaving Mrs. Pearson to look after their ailing aunt. They left the bedroom door open, and the gaslight on the landing was burning. At around 1 a.m., the women were suddenly woken by a movement in their room. Both then saw their dead Aunt Anne drift past the door, apparently heading for the sick room. Then Mrs. Pearson came rushing into the room, panting that she had seen the dead woman enter the room and cross to Harriet's bedside. Nervously, the three women made their way to Harriet's room, where they found her awake. She told them that her sister's ghost had just come to her in order to call her away. Moments later, the old lady slipped into a coma, and having lingered for most of that day, she died at just after 6 o'clock that evening. A sinister and very narrow cut-through passes under the buildings on the west side of St. James's Place and delivers us trembling to our next haunted location, Green Park. The land now occupied by Green Park is reputed to have been the burial ground for the nearby St. James's Hospital for leprous women, the site of which was commandeered by Henry VIII for the building of St. James's Palace. It is this that is said to account for the park's lack of flowers. Park keepers are said to whisper in hushed tones about one particular tree that has a reputation so sinister that it is known as the Tree of Death. No birds sing in its branches, dogs avoid it, courting couples never indulge their passion beneath it, and a feeling of melancholic gloom is said to hang heavy around it. Some people passing it in the fading light of day have been startled by a throaty, gurgling chuckle which emanates from deep within its trunk. Others have caught glimpses of a tall, shadowy figure standing beside the tree and pointing at them. The figure simply vanishes into nothingness should anyone be brave, curious, or foolish enough to approach it. Who the figure is or was, and how the Tree of Death acquired its chilling designation, have never been established or explained. As for which tree is the one that is best avoided, well, no one seems certain of exactly which one is the infamous one. Asking the gardeners for directions to it just draws blank stares, whilst a retired police officer I once met, who had a professional association with the park, responded to my request for clarification with a knowing nod of his head, and the not particularly helpful reply that I would know it when I saw it. And so, dear viewer, I turn to you for a solution to this spectral conundrum. For one amongst all these trees is the Tree of Death, and I simply ask that you study them with me and then point at the one that you think possesses the most menacing aura. Let me know in the comments below which one you think it is. And so we make our way to our penultimate destination as we arrive in Portland Place to stand before one of London's grandest hotels, the Langham, which first opened its doors in 1865 and was the trailblazer for the grand hotels of the era. Mark Twain, Arnold Bennett, and Napoleon III are just three of the illustrious names who enjoyed the Langham's hospitality in the late 19th century. Whilst on the 30th of August 1889, Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle dined here with the publisher of Lippincott's magazine, a meeting that resulted in the publication of Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray and Conan Doyle's second Sherlock Holmes story, The Sign of Four. But in the 20th century, as grander hotels opened across the capital, the Langham's fortunes dwindled, and by the 1970s it had been pressed into service as administrative offices for the BBC, although several rooms on the third floor were kept as accommodation for staff whose early morning starts or late night finishes necessitated an overnight stay. One night in 1973, announcer James Alexander Gordon was sleeping in room 333 when he suddenly awoke with a start to find a fluorescent ball hovering on the opposite side of the room. As he watched, it began to take on the clearly defined form of an Edwardian gentleman in full evening dress. Summoning up all his courage, the terrified presenter demanded to know who the apparition was and what it wanted. The question seemed to irritate the phantom, for it began to come towards him, its arms outstretched, its eyes fixed and unblinking. Unable to take any more, Gordon rushed from the room and raced down to the commissionaire, who was not in the least bit sympathetic and refused point-blank to accompany him back to the room. Gordon returned to room 333 alone and found his mysterious guest still present, although its appearance seemed less distinct than it had been. Later, when he told his colleagues at Broadcasting House about his ordeal, others told of encounters with the exact same apparition in that same bedroom. The building has now been completely renovated and restored to its former glory and once more functions as a luxury hotel. However, ghostly activity continues in room 333. In May 2003, a woman staying in the haunted room checked out of the hotel suddenly without giving any reason for her premature departure. A few days later, a letter arrived from the lady explaining that her slumbers had been interrupted by the activities of the ghost that had kept her awake by repeatedly shaking the bed during the night. The hotel hit the headlines in July 2014 when the England cricket team stayed there, and according to the Daily Mail, Ben Stokes and Stuart Broad both struggled to sleep because of the ghosts. During the Sri Lanka test, I had to move room, fast bowler Stuart Broad told the Mail. It was so hot in the room, I just couldn't sleep. All of a sudden, the taps in the bathroom came on for no reason. I turned the lights on, and the taps turned themselves off. Then, when I turned the lights off again, the taps came on. It was very weird. It really freaked me out. I ended up asking to move rooms. Ben Stokes has had some problems sleeping as well, Broad continued. He's on the 3rd floor, which is where a lot of the issues are. I'm telling you, something weird is going on. The Mail concluded its article by informing readers that the hotel declined to comment. We began our journey around the West End's haunted locations at a pub, so it is fitting that we finish at one too, albeit this has to be one of the most atmospheric and welcoming hostelries you could ever wish to encounter. It is also one of the capital's best-kept secrets, for finding it can be something of a challenge. You see, the Grenadier, for that is its name, is tucked away down a picturesque mews, coyly hiding its charms from the gaze of the uninitiated and keeping the 21st century firmly at bay. However, once you discover it, you'll be back over and over again, for this is not just a pub, it is that rarest of things these days, a true local. Indeed, such is the Grenadier's allure that several residents from its long and distinguished past seem loath to leave and have chosen to linger on as spirits, and I'm not talking about the ones behind the bar. Tradition holds that the pub's upper floors were once used as an officer's mess for a nearby barracks, whilst its cellar served as a drinking and gambling den. Here, a young subaltern is said to have once been caught cheating at cards, and his comrades meted out such a ferocious beating that the poor man died from his injuries. Although the year in which this occurred is not known, the month when it happened is thought to have been September, as this is when the pub experiences an onslaught of supernatural activity. A solemn, silent spectre has been seen moving through the low-ceilinged rooms. Objects either disappear or else are mysteriously moved overnight. Unseen hands rattle tables and chairs, and a strange, icy chill has been known to hang in the air, sometimes for days at a time. Footsteps have been heard pacing anxiously around empty rooms, whilst every so often a low, sighing moan has been heard emanating from the cellar. On one occasion, a chief superintendent from New Scotland Yard was enjoying a drink in the pub when wisps of smoke began to waft around him. His curiosity aroused, he reached towards the apparent source of the smoke and with a cry of pain pulled his hand quickly back as an invisible cigarette burnt his fingers. One busy winter's night in 1992, Graham Fox, the then head barman of the pub, went down to the cellar to fetch some cigars. Since it had been a busy night, he hadn't had the chance to have a cigarette break, and so took the opportunity of being in the cellar to light a crafty cigarette. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, Bobby, the landlord's friendly black cat, appeared. This, Graham later recalled, was unusual in itself, as the cat wasn't allowed out of the flat during opening hours, let alone allowed to roam the cellars. As I stood puffing quickly on my ciggy, he continued, several things happened in very rapid succession. The temperature plummeted. Bobby arched his back and sunk teeth and claws into my leg above the ankle, and the ashtray, which was on the chest-high shelf to my left, flew past my head and smashed with significant force against the wall. I felt a bone-deep chill of fear that I have seldom experienced since, and, needless to say, exited the cellar at the velocity of a Polaris missile.
At the top of the cellar steps, back in the warm ambience of the restaurant, I felt kind of silly. Maybe I had imagined it. But as I stepped behind the bar, my boss said, "Are you all right, Graham? You look like you've seen a ghost." Personally, I've known the Grenadier now for the best part of 42 years, and I've filmed here on quite a few occasions. Every member of every crew I have ever worked with has agreed with me that it is a special and a spellbinding place. The sense of history I encounter whenever I visit is as strong now as it was all those years ago, and I can honestly say that when that hopefully far-off day comes, when I get the chance to choose a location to haunt, the Grenadier will be high on my list, if not sitting proudly right at the top. The bat-black night has flown, and the breeze of morning blows. The first rays of dawn reach into the dark corners, sending the ghosts scattering for their daytime retreats. The West End awakes, and life returns to the streets of London. As for me, well, our night amongst the spirits has left me quite fatigued, so I'm just going to rest for a while beneath the leafy canopy of this magnificent old tree in Green Park. I mean, what's the worst that could happen?